On the morning of April 10th, 1912, the docks of Southampton were buzzing with the frenetic energy of a coronation. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious moving object ever built by human hands, was preparing for her maiden voyage. She was not merely a ship, she was a floating palace, a testament to the industrial might of the Edwardian era, and a symbol of man's conquest over nature. But amidst the thousands of passengers boarding the unsinkable ship, there was one conspicuous absence. J.P. Morgan, the titan of Wall Street, the man who effectively owned the Titanic through his shipping trust, the International Mercantile Marine Company, IMM, was supposed to be on that boat. He had a private suite specially constructed for him on B deck, complete with a private promenade and a bath made of cigar-colored marble. His luggage was already on board. But at the very last moment, Morgan canceled. He claimed he was ill and decided to stay at a resort in Aix-les-Bains, France. Yet, witnesses reported seeing him perfectly healthy, enjoying his mistress and his morning coffee, days later. Morgan's sudden change of plans might have been a stroke of incredible luck, or it might have been the first move in the coldest corporate liquidation in history. To understand why Morgan's absence is the key to unlocking the secrets of the Federal Reserve, we must look at who did board the ship. The passenger list of the Titanic read like a who's who of the global financial elite, but three names stood out above the rest: John Jacob Astor IV, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim. These men were not just wealthy, they were sovereign. John Jacob Astor IV was arguably the richest man in the world, with a fortune that, adjusted for inflation, would dwarf the net worth of modern tech billionaires. Isidor Straus was the owner of Macy's and a titan of retail. Benjamin Guggenheim was the heir to a mining empire. Collectively, they represented a massive concentration of wealth that was independent of the banking cartels. The conspiracy theory, which has persisted for over a century in the hushed corners of financial history, posits that these three men were the primary obstacles to the creation of the Federal Reserve System. The timeline is undeniably suspicious. In November 1910, the First Name Club met on Jekyll Island to secretly draft the Federal Reserve Act. Their goal was to create a centralized banking cartel that could print money and bail out Wall Street. But a plan of this magnitude required total political consensus among the elite. If a man with the resources of John Jacob Astor decided to oppose the central bank, he had the capital to bribe Congress, fund opposition newspapers, and destroy the public narrative. Astor and his peers were old money. They believed in sound money, gold, and rigid property rights. They were naturally suspicious of the new money schemes of the Rockefellers and Morgans, which relied on debt, leverage, and fiat currency. While historical records on their specific public opposition are scant and often debated, the strategic logic is sound. To install a monopoly, you must first eliminate the competition. J.P. Morgan, acting as the agent for the banking cartel, had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. The Titanic was his asset. He had absolute control over the White Star Line. He handpicked the officers. He influenced the construction. If one wanted to eliminate three of the most powerful men on Earth without raising suspicion, a tragic maritime accident was the perfect cover. It was a clean hit. No bullets, no poisons, just an iceberg in the cold North Atlantic. The deaths would be mourned as a twist of fate, not investigated as a crime. The behavior of the ship's captain, Edward Smith, adds another layer of darkness to the narrative. Captain Smith was the most experienced sailor on the Atlantic. He had navigated these waters for decades. He was a millionaire's captain, trusted by the elite. He was also a Morgan man, having served the financier's interests for years. On the night of April 14th, Smith's actions were bafflingly reckless. He drove the ship at full speed, 22 knots, into a known ice field at night with no moon. Warnings from other ships were ignored or not passed to the bridge. The binoculars for the lookouts were missing, locked in a cabinet to which the key had been accidentally left behind. When the collision occurred, Smith's reaction was almost catatonic. It was as if he was playing a role in a script he didn't fully understand, or perhaps one he understood too well. The lack of lifeboats, a regulation that Morgan's shipping trust had lobbied to keep lax, ensured that when the ship went down, the survival rate for men in first class would be statistically low. When the Titanic slipped beneath the waves at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, it took Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim with it. Astor was last seen smoking a cigarette on the deck, calmly accepting his fate as the water rose. Straus refused to get into a lifeboat while women and children were still on board, choosing to die with his wife. Guggenheim dressed in his finest evening wear, declaring, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Their deaths were heroic, but politically they were convenient. In one night, the combined wealth and influence of the opposition was liquidated. The old guard was decapitated. The reaction of the markets and the media in the aftermath was telling. The tragedy consumed the public consciousness for months, dominating the headlines. It was the perfect distraction. While the world wept for the Titanic, the bankers went to work. The money trust investigation, The Pujo Committee was raging in Washington, but the opposition was now leaderless. There was no longer a John Jacob Astor to fund a counter-movement. The path was clear. In December 1913, just 1 year and 8 months after the sinking, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress and signed by Woodrow Wilson. The timing is almost too precise to be coincidental. 1910, the plan is hatched, Jekyll Island. 1912, the opposition is removed, Titanic. 1913, the plan is executed, Federal Reserve Act. Critics of this theory argue that it is absurd to sink a massive ocean liner just to kill 3 men. They point to the financial loss of the ship itself. But to men like Morgan and Rockefeller, the Titanic was a rounding error. The cost of the ship was $7.5 million. The value of the Federal Reserve System, the ability to print the currency of the United States forever, was incalculable. It was trillions of dollars. Sacrificing a luxury liner to secure the printing press is a trade that any ruthless monopolist would make in a heartbeat. Furthermore, the ship was fully insured. IMM recovered the full value of the vessel. Financially, Morgan lost nothing. Strategically, he gained the world. There is also the peculiar matter of the Jesuit connection, a sub-theory that suggests an even deeper level of coordination. Captain Smith was sometimes referred to as a Jesuit temporal coadjutor, a layperson serving the order. The theory goes that the central bank was not just a Wall Street desire, but a geopolitical goal of the European banking dynasties, Rothschilds, and the Vatican AUS financial interests, who wanted to bring the rebellious American economy back under centralized control. While this strays into deeper speculative territory, it underscores the perception that the Titanic was a geopolitical event, not just a transportation disaster. The sinking symbolized the end of the American dream of sovereign independent wealth and the beginning of the globalist nightmare of centralized debt-based control. The sinking of the Titanic was the shock doctrine applied to the early 20th century. A massive trauma was inflicted on the public psyche. The fear and chaos generated by the disaster made the public more pliable, more willing to accept solutions from the very experts who claimed they could prevent such things in the future. The Federal Reserve was sold as a safety ship for the economy, an unsinkable vessel that would prevent financial panics. It was a cruel irony. The same men who allegedly engineered the sinking of the real ship used the fear of sinking markets to build their financial fortress. Astor's frozen body was recovered from the Atlantic days later. He had thousands of dollars in cash in his pocket, money that was now useless. His death marked the end of an era where an individual could stand against the state corporate complex. The cold water of the Atlantic washed away the old order, and from the depths, the creature from Jekyll Island rose to take its throne. To accept the premise that the Titanic was a targeted assassination, one must also accept that J.P. Morgan and his associates possessed a capacity for cold-blooded calculation that transcends ordinary criminal intent. But the rabbit hole of the Titanic conspiracy goes deeper than just a hit job on 3 wealthy men. Evidence suggests that the vessel that sank on April 15th, 1912 was arguably not the Titanic at all. It was her older, damaged sister ship, the RMS Olympic. This is the switch theory, and it provides the financial motive that makes the entire operation logical from a banker's perspective. If the assassination of Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim was the political goal, to clear the path for the Federal Reserve, the sinking of the Olympic was the financial mechanism that paid for the operation. It was the ultimate 2 birds, 1 stone scenario. Insurance fraud on a massive scale coupled with a geopolitical coup. The story begins not in 1912, but on September 20th, 1911. The Olympic, the first of the White Star Line's trio of superliners, was involved in a catastrophic collision with a British warship, the HMS Hawke. The collision tore a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooded 2 watertight compartments, and twisted her keel. In a fair court, the naval vessel would have been at fault. But the British Admiralty, protecting its own interests, ruled that the Olympic was to blame. This was a financial death sentence for the White Star Line. Because they were at fault, their insurance was void. They were liable for the repairs to the Olympic and the Hawke. The Olympic, the flagship of J.P. Morgan's shipping trust, was now a broken, uninsurable liability that would bleed money for years. She was effectively a floating wreck that couldn't pass a rigorous inspection, yet she was too expensive to scrap. Morgan was facing a liquidity crisis. His shipping trust, the International Mercantile Marine, IMM, was already overleveraged. He needed a bailout. And as the chief architect of modern finance, Morgan knew that the best way to erase a bad asset is to convert it into an insurance claim. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Patch up the damaged Olympic, swap her identity with the newly built Titanic, send the fake Titanic, the damaged Olympic, into the Atlantic, stage a controlled sinking, and collect the insurance money for a brand new ship. The Titanic, the real brand new ship, would then quietly sail on as the Olympic for decades, generating pure profit. The physical evidence for the switch is compelling and disturbing. Naval architects and historians have pointed to specific structural discrepancies that are visible in photographs of the two ships. The Olympic had 16 portholes on her sea deck. The Titanic was built with 14. Yet, when the ship departed Southampton on its doomed voyage, photographs clearly show 16 portholes, the fingerprint of the Olympic. Furthermore, the Titanic that sailed had a mysterious list to port, a tilt that the Olympic had developed after her keel was twisted in the collision. Why would a brand new ship lean? And perhaps most damning, when the wreck was discovered by Robert Ballard, the propeller on the ocean floor bore the serial number 401. The Titanic S hull number was 401. The Olympic AS was 400. Critics say this proves it was the Titanic, but the conspirators argue that the propellers were the only part of the Olympic that were too damaged to use, so they were swapped with the Titanic's new propellers during the repair. The ship that sank had the Olympic's hull damaged and the Titanic's propellers new. It was a Frankenstein vessel, doomed before it left the dock. This context transforms the disaster from an accident into a controlled demolition that went wrong. The plan, allegedly, was not to kill 500 people. It was to sink the ship slowly, close to a rescue vessel, offload the passengers, and let the hull disappear. The designated rescue ship was the SS Californian, captained by Stanley Lord. The Californian stopped in the ice field that night, despite having no passengers and no urgent cargo. It sat there, with its boilers firing, less than 20 miles away from the Titanic. Captain Lord claimed he saw the rockets, but thought they were company signals, not distress flares. The theory suggests the Californian was waiting for the signal to move in and pick up the survivors, completing the fraud without the mass casualties. But they miscalculated. They underestimated the damage caused by the iceberg, or, as some theories suggest, the structural weakness caused by a coal fire that had been burning in the ship's bunker for weeks before departure. The ship sank too fast. The Californian was too far away. The controlled insurance write-off turned into a massacre. This catastrophe played directly into the hands of the Federal Reserve proponents. The sinking created a panic in the insurance and financial markets. It caused a sudden liquidity crunch. It was a mini version of the panic of 1907. The bankers used this fear to reinforce their narrative. Oh, the world is volatile. Unexpected disasters happen. We need a system that can provide stability when the unthinkable occurs. While the public was obsessed with the human tragedy, the money trust was hard at work in Washington. The Pujo Committee hearings, which were investigating the banking cartel's control over America, were overshadowed by the Titanic inquiry. The headlines shifted from bankers control the economy to iceberg sinks ship. It was the ultimate distraction. The sinking sucked the oxygen out of the room for the anti-central bank movement. With Astor and Guggenheim dead, the opposition lost its voice and its wallet. There was no one left to buy the newspaper ads or bribe the senators to stop the Federal Reserve Act. We must also look at the role of wireless telegraphy in the aftermath. The news of the sinking was controlled entirely by the Marconi Company. Guglielmo Marconi was financed by, you guessed it, banking interests allied with Morgan. In the immediate hours after the sinking, there was a media blackout followed by a wave of disinformation. Early headlines reported, "All saved, Titanic being towed to Halifax." Who planted these false stories? They served to keep the stock market calm for 24 hours, allowing the insiders to position themselves before the truth was revealed. It also allowed Morgan to manage the IMM stock price, which should have gone to zero but managed to survive. The control of information was absolute. The narrative was shaped before the Carpathia even docked in New York with the survivors. J.P. Morgan was never called to testify about why he canceled his trip. He was never questioned about the insurance. The inquiry, led by Lord Mersey in England, who was also connected to the shipping trusts, was a whitewash. It focused on excessive speed and ice, ignoring the structural failures, the swapped identity, and the mysteriously absent owner. It concluded accidental death. Case closed. The sinking of the Titanic was the physical manifestation of the philosophy that would govern the 20th century. The elite are too big to fail. The common man is expendable. The steerage passengers, the poor, were locked below decks while the lifeboats were launched. The lifeboats were not filled to capacity because the crew was worried about crowding. This is a perfect metaphor for the Federal Reserve System that followed. The Fed is a lifeboat for the banks. When the crash comes, the bankers get the seats. The public is locked in steerage, told to listen to the band play while the water rises. The 1,500 souls who froze to death in the North Atlantic were the first casualties of the new financial order. They were the collateral damage in a corporate restructuring of the global economy. The unsinkable ship was a lie. The stable dollar promised by the Fed was a lie. Both were marketing gimmicks designed to lure the public into a vessel that was built to fail for the benefit of its owners. In the final section, we will examine the aftermath, how the Federal Reserve Act was rammed through Congress in the dead of night, while the country was still reeling from the psychological shock of the era, and how the Titanic formula, create a disaster, offer a solution. Consolidate power became the blueprint for every major government expansion for the next 100 years. The sinking of the Titanic on April 15, 1912, created a political vacuum in Washington, D.C. that was as cold and empty as the North Atlantic itself. In the 18 months between the disaster and the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913, the opposition to centralized banking effectively evaporated. It wasn't just that Astor, Strauss, and Guggenheim were dead. It was that the entire old money establishment was demoralized and distracted. The Senate hearings into the disaster consumed the public's attention for nearly a year. Every headline was about icebergs, lifeboats, and maritime regulations. There was no oxygen left for a complex debate about monetary policy. The banking cartel, operating through their political proxies like Senator Nelson Aldrich and Colonel House, used this cover of darkness to finalize their coup. They realized that while the public was looking at the ocean, they could steal the bank. The mechanism of passage was a masterclass in political stealth, relying on the confusion and fear generated by the era's instability. The Titanic had shattered the public's faith in technology and corporate benevolence, but paradoxically, the bankers twisted this fear to their advantage. They argued that the financial system was just like a ship, prone to sudden, unexpected disasters that no individual captain could foresee. Therefore, they argued, the economy needed a centralized rudder and a safety mechanism that could be deployed instantly. They framed the Federal Reserve not as a bank, but as an insurance policy against future panics. They used the trauma of 1907 and the psychological unease of 1912 to sell a solution that promised elasticity and stability. The irony was palpable. The men who allegedly sank the safest ship in the world were now asking the public to trust them with the safety of the entire economy. On December 22, 1913, the trap was sprung. The timing was deliberate, designed to bypass the scrutiny that a full Senate session would have brought. Congress was eager to adjourn for Christmas. Many senators who might have opposed the bill, those from rural states who feared Wall Street control, had already left Washington to return to their families. The money trust lobbyists, who stayed behind, pushed the Federal Reserve Act to the floor for an immediate vote. It was a legislative ambush. There was no rigorous debate. There was no time for the opposition to rally, because the leaders of that opposition were at the bottom of the ocean or politically neutralized. Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., whose son would later become the famous aviator, was one of the few who stood his ground, declaring, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth." When the president signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the money trust investigation, will be legalized, but his voice was drowned out by the rush to the exits. On December 23, 1913, 2 days before Christmas, President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law. He did so with a gold pen, smiling for the cameras, likely unaware or willfully ignorant that he had just signed away the sovereignty of the American people. The Federal Reserve System that was born that day was the direct result of the Titanic strategy. Eliminate the competition, distract the public, and execute the takeover during a crisis. The structure of the Fed was exactly what J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg had designed on Jekyll Island 3 years earlier. It was a private corporation, owned by its member banks, masquerading as a government entity. It had the power to issue currency, Federal Reserve notes, that was backed by the taxpayers' debt, not by the bankers' gold. It had the power to set interest rates, effectively controlling the price of every asset in the nation. And most importantly, it was independent, meaning it was accountable to no one. The Titanic opponents, Astor, Strauss, Guggenheim, had warned that such a system would lead to inflation, endless wars, and the enslavement of the working class through debt. They were right. Since 1913, the US dollar has lost 99% of its purchasing power. We have fought 2 world wars, funded entirely by Federal Reserve inflation. We have seen the rise of a deep state, funded by a printing press that no voter can turn off. The warnings of the men who died on the Titanic were silenced by the water, and their nightmares have become our reality. The connection between the Titanic and the Fed is the ultimate red pill of financial history. It forces you to question the official narrative of the 20th century. If the greatest financial power on earth, the Morgan-Rockefeller cartel, was willing to sacrifice a luxury liner and 1,500 innocent people to secure their monopoly, what else have they been willing to do? Was the Great Depression of 1929 an accident or a controlled demolition to consolidate more wealth? Was the removal of the gold standard in 1971 a mistake or a planned theft? The Titanic was the original sin of the modern era. It was the blood sacrifice that anointed the new gods of finance. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, just months before the Fed was officially born, almost as if his mission was complete. He left an estate worth $80 million, a vast fortune, but surprisingly small compared to his reputation. John D. Rockefeller famously said upon hearing the amount, "And to think he wasn't even a rich man." This reveals the true nature of the game. It wasn't about personal wealth, it was about control. Morgan didn't need to own all the money, he just needed to build the machine that controlled everyone else's money. He built it, and we are still trapped inside it. So, what is the lesson for the sovereign individual in 2026? It is that the system was never designed to protect you. It was designed to extract from you. The Titanic had lifeboats for the rich and locked gates for the poor. The Federal Reserve has quantitative easing for the banks and inflation for the workers. The structure hasn't changed, only the technology has. To survive, you must build your own lifeboat. 1. Don't trust the captain. The experts, Fed chairs, Treasury secretaries, CEOs, who tell you the system is unsinkable, are lying or deluded. They will drive the economy into the iceberg again and again because they have a golden parachute. 2. Secure your own passage. Do not rely on a pension, Social Security, or a bank account to save you. Those are steerage tickets. You need first-class assets, gold, Bitcoin, land, skills that you own outright. 3. Watch the exits. When the smart money, the modern Morgans, starts canceling their trips, when insiders start selling their stock, buying bunkers in New Zealand, or moving to non-extradition countries, pay attention. They know when the ice field is approaching. The Titanic didn't just sink a ship, it sank the old world. The Federal Reserve rose from the wreckage. But every empire eventually hits its own iceberg. The US dollar is currently steaming at full speed toward a debt wall that it cannot turn away from. The band is playing, the champagne is flowing, but the lookouts are shouting, "Can you hear them?" Or are you waiting for the captain to tell you it's safe?